What, for instance, can you tell us about the trend in the last maybe decade about militarization of the border?
Oh, it's a continuing trend that we can argue is, I argue in my book that's been going on for at least 100 years.
100 years.
And it's sort of the same models have been recycled recently. What we look at in the early 20th century is basically putting boots on the ground, as the Border Patrol likes to say, and that would have been the Texas Rangers, who were used early on as law enforcement, but they were also used in ways to remove migrants or people of Mexican descent, whether they're migrants or citizens of the United States, from particular areas or from the borderlands. So there's a lot of violence in those particular periods. Also, we look at the placement of the military on the border when there was a case of Pancho Villa or Francisco Villa invading southern New Mexico, which became a national security issue, and where 100,000 National Guardsmen were eventually placed on the US-Mexico border, never entering Mexico, but were on what they call border duty from California to Texas, with the vast majority being in Texas. And we also had the punitive expedition, which were about 10,000 or so military, or 5,000, forget the number, that were going into Mexico in pursuit of Francisco Villa.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gone through phases in regards to whether it's national security threats. Later on we also deal with prohibition. So the concept of smuggling illicit goods, that fell onto the shoulders of the newly minted in 1924 Border Patrol, who was initially meant to enforce immigration laws that were recently passed, especially in 1917, 1921, and 1924 as well. But because of prohibition, found themselves enforcing more and more prohibition laws, mm-hmm. Because of smuggling of alcohol and other goods from Mexico into the United States. Mm-hmm. So with that, we see the issues of smuggling coming out. World War II, obviously, with the threat of national security, but Mexico worked in cooperation with the United States in supplying labor, known as the Bracero program, to the United States, as many workers were volunteering for the Army and off to Asia and Europe. Also, the Mexican government supplied an Air Force in support of the Allied effort in World War II. But we also have an issue of where we actually forcibly removed unauthorized immigrants in the 1950s, what's known as Operation Wetback. President Eisenhower initiated this particular operation because of his placement of a military General Swift into Department of Immigration, and he instituted a military style of removal, mostly based on fear. In other words, they spent a lot of money on propaganda with radio stations and so forth, and literature, scaring people who voluntarily left. This was also a continuation to a degree to what we saw in the 1930s. I kind of skipped over the 1930s, but we had the repatriation of Mexicans in the 1930s because of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, the belief that immigrant workers were occupying jobs that native citizens can use. We have upwards to 2 million people that were repatriated, with about half of those U.S. citizens repatriated to Mexico.
So the same rhetoric was used.
Oh, very much so.
80 years ago.
Very much so. Like I said, one of the conclusions that my book makes is that we haven't really come up with anything new in at least 100 years. The formulas of, and quite frankly, Donald Trump mentioned Operation Wetback during his campaign as a successful operation, which it was not. The INS most notably fudged their numbers, but they also weren't able to sustain that operation quite frankly, because of cost. Mm-hmm. And despite of physically removing immigrants out of the United States, many immigrants just came back. Mm-hmm. Or if they didn't come back, they came back as Glasredos, which was still in effect in the 1950s. It doesn't end until 1964.
So they were mostly scared away and like...
Mostly scared away, and they were physically removed, but again, they would just come back. So then the idea was that, well, let's remove them further in the interior of Mexico, which became, you know, a little bit more challenging for a lot of people, but again, they still came back. But what the biggest problem was is that it was extremely costly. The contractors that were involved in this removal, the airlines, the bus companies, the railroads, that drove up the prices because they're taking their own, you know, vehicle, I mean airplanes and what have you, out of the market in order to satisfy this governmental plan. So in essence, they were going to say, well, we're going to make money off of it, and they did. And they drove up the prices, so it became too costly and highly ineffective because at the end of the day, unauthorized immigrants were still coming in and working back at their jobs. And the demand was still there. It was simply a political move. There was no real, at the 1950s, there was no real need or reason for, there wasn't a Pancho Villa attack, there wasn't a Great Depression, there wasn't anything like that. Yes, we have the Cold War, but there wasn't any indication that migrants were somehow bringing in Cold War, communist rhetoric. I mean, the FBI did put out a public announcement that we must be aware that immigrant coming over with a tattered suitcase and tattered suit could possibly bring over an atomic bomb in that suitcase, which I don't know if that's actually at the time technologically possible. As I don't think it's even done today. I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't. But it was put out there as a public, like, you know, keep your watch because, you know, Fulanito may seem like harmless and seem like he's just coming over to get a job, but he may have, he literally said they had an atomic bomb in that suitcase.
That's crazy.
So there was this proponent of fear in the language that we're seeing today, right? As we just saw last night, the suggestion, not suggestion, the outright claim that migrants are violent criminals regardless, and then they have to prove otherwise, which is, the data shows is complete opposite of that.